start? Good to go? Good to go. Hello. Good morning. Welcome to this panel about navigating Europe's new volatility. My name is Francesco Guerra. I'm the financial editor for the Wall Street Journal based in New York, but I'm originally from Italy, so panelists should be advised to go easy on Italy when we talk about Europe, because I'm making notes. But we have a great cast to talk about such a big issue and so many big issues to do with Europe. So I'll go from my left, Howard Shore, who is the founder and CEO of a boutique investment bank and also an investor in parts of Europe in areas such as telecom. James McCormack, who is the global head of sovereigns for Fitch Ratings, it's a credit rating agency. Mohamed Al-Arian, who's one of the finest thinkers on economic matters, I guess, in the world, and his day job is as a chief economic advisor to Allianz, the big German insurers. Claire Cockleton, one of the pioneers of fintech, financial technological innovation, and who will talk to us about entrepreneurship in Europe and the differences with the US. And then last but not least, Peter Bayer, member of the German parliament and a former lawyer, or you never former lawyer, right? You're current lawyer, also member of the German parliament. So we have a wide variety of expertise here on the podium and a lot of topics to cover. So I will start straight away, and we will leave about 10 minutes towards the end for audience questions. So please think about questions. We'll have roaming microphones, and the panel is here to answer your questions at the end. So I will start with the macro picture, and I want to bring in James first. So Europe is in the middle of this quantitative easing, enormous stimulus measures. We've seen the move in the currency. We've seen the moves in the financial markets. Now, is that enough? Is that going to work to revitalize the European economy?
Okay, yeah. I think when we think about Europe, it's very difficult for us to have one sort of single view of Europe as a whole, even if you're just talking about the Eurozone. Because from our perspective, we rate every country. We've got ratings that go from AAA in Germany, Netherlands, Luxembourg, all the way down to CCC in Greece, and everything in between. Every rating level is represented. So it's hard to have a single view on Europe. And perversely, I think it's a region that suffers from too much convergence and too little convergence at the same time. I think there's probably too much convergence in credit markets, where we've seen a compression of spreads and a convergence of spreads. And that's where we differ, because there's too little convergence in terms of some of the fundamentals, the macroeconomic fundamentals, and certainly the credit fundamentals and the sovereign credit fundamentals. So we have quite a different view, I would say, than the market. And the issues that we're focused on, as I said, are really the credit fundamentals, particularly what I look at, the sovereign, so I'm looking at government debt. And the issues that surround government debt remain problematic in Europe, and we don't really see QE addressing that in and of itself. It's certainly helpful, but QE in and of itself is not going to fix a fiscal problem. I think we've kind of learned that in Japan. And when we think about those government debt dynamics in Europe, I guess a quick story, we went back and we looked at instances of advanced economies that were able to reduce their government debt to GDP ratio in a meaningful way over, say, a 5 to 7 year period. There's not that many examples. There's around 15 or so from the early 1970s. In kind of an average characteristic which they shared, they grew at around 3.5% to 4%. They ran primary surpluses at around 4% of GDP, and real interest rates were around 3.5%. So the real interest rate, you can say Europe or the Eurozone's almost there, but none of them are running primary surpluses that are large enough, and none of them are growing fast enough to really bring the debt to GDP ratios down. So those are the issues that we're focused on. It's very much a public finance focus from our perspective and a macro focus. So yes, QE helps, but it doesn't resolve the issues that are kind of that we're focused on in terms of the ratings and the rating outlooks.
Mohamed, what's your perspective on QE and some of the issues that James was talking about?
So QE does help. It helps by making the currency weaker, making exporters more competitive. It helps by bringing down interest rates to negative level, pushing people to take more risk, improving a little bit the risk appetite within the Eurozone. That plus oil has helped a lot. So the numbers that we will see, the Eurozone numbers, are going to look better. However, and these are two very important qualifications. One is they're not good enough. So they're not good enough to overcome some serious structural impediments, including lack of structural reforms. They're not good enough to overcome a mismatch between those willing to spend but not having the wallet, and those having the wallet but not wanting to spend. And they're not good enough to grow out of debt problems. So better at the overall level, but not good enough. I think what's really interesting and new is that problems that have been allowed to fester for a long time are taking their own dynamics. So I no longer worry about Brexit. I don't think that anybody wants to go down in history as having made the decision for Greece to exit the Eurozone. The Greeks don't want that to make that decision, and I don't think anybody else wants to make that decision. But we're getting really close to an accident where Greece ends up with capital controls, ends up with debt defaults, and it's an accident that causes Greece to exit the Eurozone. And the problem with accidents is they're much harder to control. The geopolitics, I think Ukraine is a serious issue for Europe, and we are nowhere near resolving the geopolitics there. And then finally, the national politics. The growth of the non-traditional parties is across the Eurozone, it's across Europe. So what's interesting for me is that you have these wild cards in the system that are starting to become more influential and are starting to be able to influence a story that otherwise would be easy to tell. And the easy is, yes, it's better, but it's not good enough. But it's the wild cards that are going to be defining where Europe goes over the next 12 to 24 months.
And we're going to talk about two of those wild cards later on, the issue of the national political system and to a certain extent immigration. But if we stay, Peter, on the macroeconomic picture in QE for a second, so Germany is in this interesting position of being, at least in the person of its central bank, extremely vocal against QE, and at the same time one of the biggest beneficiary of a lower currency. So where do you see it from the perspective of Germany?
Well, I think we have to not only focus on the single nations, on the single countries. Obviously, I'm a member of the German Parliament, but we have to see the broader picture. I'm always speaking of the club of 28 EU member states. I think, speaking of QE, this is a program of 60 billion, I guess, if I know exactly, 60 billion euros each and every month. I think we will see an effect of this, so something is happening. I think one of the obstacles in Europe as a whole, or I mean, among many other things, is that the national economies are so different. We have a broad range of diversified national economies in Europe, and with the principle of consensus that we have in all these European institutions, including the European Central Bank, this is really a problem. So, coming, for example, to the definition of what the mandate of the ECB is, you have the very core of one of the major problems of a fiscal union, for example. The mandate, the definition of price stability it's completely up to the ECB. What this means. So the ECB is a very independent, politically independent institution, but and it's extremely difficult to change this. And one of the European politicians, the heads of state, they have to ask the question: do we want to, do we want to reconfigure the European institutions, including the ECB? So I think the European Union as a whole is facing a lot of challenges, both on the fiscal, on the economic side as well, and Mohammed addressed this, on the geopolitical side. You mentioned Ukraine, Russia, the immigration pressure that is a big challenge for Europe. We will talk about this a little bit later. And again, I think the QE program will have an effect, but from a German perspective, I mean, we are doing pretty fine. Our economy is pretty fine, but we have to take into consideration that we're just one country out of 28. So we have to somehow coordinate this on a political level, and hence also on a fiscal and economic level, how to get these different influences right within the European Union. I think this, on a political level, is a tough challenge. There has been a recent summit of the European heads of states, and there will be a next summit in June where they will address investments, structural reforms, and also fiscal consolidation. I think these things are at the core of the challenges if we speak also of economic growth in Europe.
Right. Thank you. So let's now move from the macro to the micro, and I'd like to bring in Claire at this point. The received wisdom in the United States, for sure, is that Europe is hampered by a lack of entrepreneurship, a very difficult, if non-existent venture capital base, and that therefore there's an inflexibility to the European economy that the US economy doesn't have, for example, especially on this coast. Tell us about your experience and what you think about that, and what you see from your perspective that could be done in your chosen sector, which is financial technology.
Sure. Well, I set up a technology accelerator for fintech entrepreneurs a couple years ago called Level 39 in Canary Wharf. And this place is designed to attract entrepreneurs from around the world to set their businesses up here and take advantage of the favorable policy environment and regulatory environment and access to talent and a unique trading location of London to really foster not only the growth of entrepreneurship, but the development of new innovations, particularly in fintech. One of the major influencers of why we have developed a fintech cluster in the UK is this increase in access to capital. And this has been recent over the last 2 or 3 years. But this access to capital is being, the barriers to entry are lowering because we have greater corporate venture funds being established, greater SME lending coming from the banks, and this is being encouraged by the Funding for Lending scheme, as well as the Enterprise Investment scheme, as well as the Small Business Act in the UK. And so younger companies are seeing the UK not only as a favorable place to do business, but can access new forms of capital. And this isn't just coming from the VC community. This is also coming from the providers of alternative finance. So these are the peer-to-peer lenders and the crowdfunders who are bringing fintech innovations to the marketplace, and they're actually fueling the development of the SME sector across the industry sectors in the UK.
So is it just in the UK? I mean, is it a UK-specific accelerator, or there's companies from the rest of Europe as well?
So my accelerator is in London, so it's based in the UK, but we attract companies from around the world. And they come to London because they see it as a very favorable environment for particularly fintech development. It's also an incredible base to be internationally focused, to expand globally. So being connected to Europe is very, very important, and our position geographically is also very important as we trade with East and West.
Final follow-up question. Do these when you talk to these companies, do they care about this other stuff we're talking about? Are they worried about Europe, a collapse of the Eurozone or a Greek exit, or is that part of their decision-making process or not?
I think that the proximity to Europe is really, really important to them. One of the major issues for our firms is talent and attracting talent from across Europe. So being close to Europe is really important. And fintech depends on an international stage. It depends on being able to export. It depends on creating strong relationships with global trade and investment hubs like Singapore, like New York, like Sydney. So it's really important for them that London, the UK, is close to Europe, and that we're seen as a global player.
Great. So Howard, you have these two interesting hats, right? You invest yourself, and then you help other people invest and expand.
Yes.
So how much of this volatility and all these macroeconomic issues are weighing on your business and your company's business?
Well, I think I'd like to put that question into a little bit of context, just going back to the macro. I certainly agree with Mohammed about the benefits of QE are starting to take effect. They're not going to be enough. We were sitting here a year ago talking about Europe, and I think we were a lot more pessimistic for good reason. What's changed is a collapse in oil prices, a very significant reduction in the euro, and very, very loose monetary policy leading to virtually 0% interest rates in Northern Europe. And that's going to create, in my opinion, an extremely strong German economy this year. I think it will outperform expectations, and it will drag up what I call the Deutschmark block. We've also got a very strongly performing UK economy.
Who's in the bloc? Who's in the Deutschmark bloc?
Well, certainly countries like Holland, obviously smaller countries like Austria, Finland, I would say probably the whole of Scandinavia, the Czech Republic, Poland, all the countries around Germany will benefit from the strength of the German economy, and also they'll independently benefit from the euro reduction themselves, because they've got export industries themselves. So I would be much more optimistic about the performance of the Eurozone in the short term. The other country that's really driving potential growth in the Eurozone is the UK, which is also a very strong economy. So I think what's the black mark on the horizon is really politics. And politics could be adversely affecting the opportunity for entrepreneurs, but it could be actually beneficial. Why? Because you asked me what's my experience. My experience is being an entrepreneur in the UK is much easier than it is in Germany. Why?
Like no one is shocked.
Because
No one.
because the labour market is so much more flexible. I started a business in the mid-80s, 3 of us. We grew person by person. To do that in Germany is very hard because you can't shed labour if you get it wrong. That's a cultural issue in Europe. We have to change that. Now, the key thing for me is what happens in the UK election in 2 weeks' time. Because if David Cameron remains Prime Minister, he will have an EU referendum. And whatever the Germans say, and the rest of Europe say, I will bet a very large amount of money that there's major reform in Europe in order to keep the UK in, because they don't want the UK to leave under any circumstances. They've got problems with Greece, they've got problems with Ukraine. There's no chance, in my opinion, that Europe would allow the UK to leave, and as a consequence, the government of the UK will negotiate structural changes which benefit Europe generally. Now, the problem childs of Europe that really make the big difference, I'm sorry to say, no disrespect, are France and Italy. The other countries are obviously smaller, so they make less impact. We need to see a recovery in France and Italy. Now, France has an election in 2 years' time. Things could change for the better. So things could change for the worse. We could get Ed Miliband. We could get a more slower growing, we could get the UK economy will definitely be adversely affected. The environment for entrepreneurs will become much tougher. It will be an anti-business environment. It won't be probably as bad as France, but it's going to go in that direction. He's going to be fiscally constrained, and monetary policy is largely independent, but within the constraints of that, he's going to adopt a relatively anti-business profile. That's going to be bad. But if Cameron wins and we get a change of government in France, things could improve. So there is an opportunity for structural reform in Europe, and I think the UK could be pushing that through, and the advantages that entrepreneurs have in the UK relative to the rest of Europe, we could see potentially happen. That's the blue sky.
The rest of us all looked at Peter when he said Germany will do whatever it takes.
So let's
Yeah,
have Peter
I
react.
was actually wanted to ask you a question. You know, you wrapped it up so nicely in one sentence. We have to change this.
Yes.
You were, if I understood you correctly, referring to the labor market. It's too flexible. So give me, I'm trying to learn from you.
Yes.
How should we do this?
Well,
What would be your expectations from German politics, from the Chancellor, from the government? I'm a member of Angela Merkel's, of the Chancellor's party.
Yes.
And under this so-called grand coalition that we
Yeah.
have with the Social Democrats, who seem to be much stronger than for the Conservative Party, to which I belong. You know, speaking of minimum wage and all these things, with very, very strong unions, very strong social democratic ministers in the government. So what would be your expectations to make it easier for all these entrepreneurs to feel more comfortable to do business in Germany?
Well, I think the labour market reforms that are required are going to be more required in countries like France and Italy, because they've got the unemployment problem. Germany doesn't. So what I would say is that despite a more difficult environment to hire people and let people go, because of the other strengths within Germany, the economy is working largely, in my view, because the training of the workforce and also the consensual nature of society. But I'll give you an example. In Germany, from my experience, if a man wants to take paternity leave and the government's going to pay, he has to take a minimum of 2 months. Now, for a small business, if you've got 5 people and somebody's off work for 2 months, that's an absolute killer. If you're BMW, it's absolutely fine. It's just a cost. You factor it in. But if you're one of 5, that's an absolute killer. So it's really hard to start a new business, employ people. The other point in a country like Germany is it's really hard to let people go. And when you do let people go, you have to do it on a socially based merit system. So you decide who within the team has got most to lose in terms of having a family to look after. So you might not be able to let the least capable person go. These are extraordinary things. You know, when you look at the United States, a lot of the people in the room are in the United States. They would not understand that how inflexible the labour laws are. So I think that in order for Europe to compete in the future, if you want to just have a social welfare mindset, we're going to go backwards. And there's got to be a balance between being fair to the workforce, but also being competitive.
Okay. So, did you want to react to?
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised of the examples that you gave, but I find it at least in Germany very unrealistic that this is going to get it back to a level where there's more hire and fire, for example, because over decades the unions have fought for this to reach, and they're still there, fighting to reach this social welfare state that we have, and so far it has worked quite nicely. I mean, that you were referring to the SMEs, small and medium-sized companies, which are the backbone of the German economy. So I know that this is that causes problems, and we have very, you're right. There's not enough flexibilities, especially for smaller companies, startups, for example. But I don't think this really causes a problem if you look to the facts and figures, to the strength of the German economy, because these strong labor laws from a employee's perspective, have been in place for a longer time now. It's still, the German economy is quite strong. I think on the venture capital infrastructure side, for startups to offering a legal framework and a VC infrastructure. This is something that Germany's politicians need to take care much more and look into this much more. We have in Berlin, we were talking about this earlier before starting the session here. In Berlin, there's a trend, even a hype for startup companies, and if you look to the warehouses and their small thinkers and 3D printers, and a lot of things are going on. And
why don't we ask Claire? Why didn't you base yourself in Berlin?
Yeah, this is
why did you go to London?
It's definitely
you were
an option.
speaking about earlier. We are close to Europe. The United Kingdom belongs to Europe still.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure the Brits in the room would agree with that.
We're not going there. We only got 1 hour. We're not going there. Brits talking about Europe.
But can I follow up with
Howard?
I may take a bet, depending on the odds, that Europe will do whatever it takes to keep the UK in. That's a very, very strong statement. Whatever it takes to keep the UK in?
I will make that bet that Cameron, if he wins, will make major new concessions and then advise the British public that they should stay.
Okay.
And that
Meaningful
You
concessions.
promised the referendum.
meaningful concessions. Yeah, but the public will do eventually what they're told to do because they don't really understand the issues fully. So if the Conservatives, it's true, it's complex.
As a politician, I would never. But that's why we have this role play.
Yeah, you know, it's true because look, if the Conservatives and the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationalists all say we should stay, the public, in my view, will vote to stay. If the Conservatives, for instance, were to say we think we should leave, they would stir up xenophobia aided by UKIP. And there's a very significant chance the public would actually say, okay, we want to leave.
You disagree? You think that there's a good chance that the British population will vote to separate itself from Europe?
I mean, I don't want to put myself in this debate other than to say it's really hard to pursue two conflicting objectives. One is a Eurozone that's getting more and more integrated and will have to get more and more integrated. And then the EU members that are not part of the Eurozone who want to be less and less integrated. And these are two objectives that at some point are going to be conflicting.
Yes.
And Europe is going to have to make decisions.
But not in the next 2 years because they can't afford the risk. Maybe they could have made that choice from a position of strength. Maybe France and Germany could have kicked the UK out if they were being difficult in the 80s. But today, no chance, in my opinion.
So, Jim, I want to bring you back. You mentioned the problem of too little confluence and then too much confluence. So this is the issue that we're debating here. Do you share Howard's view that if you get the right government in France, for example, or in Italy, things will get better? That the blue sky will start shining over Europe?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I don't know that we have the wrong governments in France or Italy, but you know the agendas are just very modest, shall we say? I think both in both countries. I mean, the Italian Prime Minister started with a very ambitious agenda, but quickly started to step back from that. With a reform a month and measure me in 100 days and all those kinds of things. That sort of discussion faded away reasonably quickly, and the French government has shown just how difficult it is to move forward with the reforms that we all know what the reforms need to be in places like France and Italy. It's labor market reform, making the labor market more flexible, as we've all been discussing. In France, there's some relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of things like the retail market and Sunday hours and things that here in the U.S. you would find hard to understand, really, that these restrictions are still in place. But I think there's the consensus hasn't been reached internally within those countries yet that this agenda really needs to move forward in an aggressive fashion. I just don't think they're necessarily there yet.
So, and these are all obviously very important and true points. Yeah, if you look at the bond market, it's as if none of this exists. I mean, we have like some of the most depressed bond deals in Europe, in the world, including some negative yields, which is almost an impossibility. So how do you explain that?
Well, as I said, this is where we kind of diverge from the market. We're going to look at the credit fundamentals. The market's going to be guided by a number of other things, including what central banks are up to. So, it's difficult. If you just look at the credit fundamentals alone, you don't reach the conclusions of where the spreads are in Europe today, or even kind of pre-crisis. So we have had divergent views from the market in the past, and it looks like we're probably going to continue to have divergent views from the market going forward, because I can't really see a big adjustment in the European bond market, maybe outside of something like a Greek accident.
So let's move away from the nitty-gritty of economics for a second and talk about what you called in the wild cards. Certainly Ukraine, immigration is a big issue at the moment because it's always been a big issue in Europe, but now because of the tragedy just off the coast of Italy, it's become even more important. So Mohammed, how worried should we be? I mean, should we be awake at night thinking about this, or are those like black swan scenarios that are unlikely to happen, even though they would be devastating if they did?
I'm not sure what else keeps you awake at night, so I can't answer whether you should be awake at night.
I'm not going to tell you.
I do think Ukraine is serious. The economic element of Ukraine is important. You're looking at a country that GDP has contracted by 15%, 1.5, in the first quarter. Industrial production is down 22%. It's a country that is imploding. it's very hard to maintain social stability, let alone a very fragile ceasefire. So what happens? So this is to use game theory, this is a game with three parties who don't trust each other. You have Russia, you have the West, and you have the non-state actors in Ukraine. Okay. To solve that game, in game theory, without people being able to trust each other or verify what other people do, is virtually impossible. So play this movie forward. If the ceasefire collapses, either because of internal pressure or because of another Russian adventure, and Peter, you may speak to this, but I don't think the West will have any choice but to tighten level 3 sanctions on finance and energy. They simply will have no choice but to do that. If that happens, the probability of Russia imposing counter-sanctions is very high. And those counter-sanctions will hit energy. And suddenly, that alone will tip Europe into recession. Right? So in addition to all the political issues, there's this real economic reality that you may get a disruption from the East, whereby you have a process that no one trusts anybody else, and therefore it will continue to deteriorate. If you think that President Putin, with the pressure in Russia, will change course, then you worry less. I don't see that happening. So I think that is a bigger risk to Europe than what the markets are pricing in right now. And don't expect the markets to price it in until it happens. Right? Because you can get close to it, but as long as it doesn't happen, then you've got QE in your favor, and and markets have understood how powerful QE is in terms of its impact, not on the economy, but on asset prices.
Peter, what's your sense on these big issues that we just discussed?
First of all, looking back when the European Union first implemented the sanctions, again, I mean, they have to do this to all 28 countries with a unanimous vote. So it came to me as a surprise, given all the differences and dependencies. Speaking of energy supply, for example, in these countries, but still they're in place, and we have reached, and I think quite rightly so, these strong sanctions, economic sanctions. Maybe we should go even further, as Mohamed indicated. I'm absolutely convinced that it is right to do more things, parallel at the same time, diplomatic political talks, and at the same time the sanctions. But one thing that I don't really think I know, I don't know if anybody knows, is what do we want to achieve? Is it realistic? What is the definition of a solution in this conflict that we have in eastern Ukraine? Is this a autonomous region in the east of Ukraine that does a referendum so that it is to become a part of Russia? Is this completely given up of Vladimir Putin's strategy to stop territorial expansion? I don't see this happen realistically. I don't think we know yet, the West, the European Union, and our partners, to know what we want to achieve, which is a problem. And then again, you have the unanimous vote system. So this is really why, with all the criticism and all these back and forth, should we deliver lethal weapons, yes or no, and which I believe would not bring us a step closer to any solution. But this is a different story. I think it was right for these so-called Normandy format to have Minsk I and negotiate Minsk II, which is basically the implementation document of Minsk I. And that it is a very fragile ceasefire situation that we have there, but at least it's a very, very small success. Now I know this needs to be controlled. I mean, we're leaving now the economic issues, but it all belongs together. These geopolitics have a very direct influence on the markets, on the economies in the region. The role of the OSCE, I mean, can they really control? Do they have access? No, they do not have it. So again, I don't have the answer. What would you think a solution to this conflict would be, and how long this is going to happen? What I think is a really concrete, direct threat to Europe as it is there. That people are thinking that it is closing in Germany. I talk to my constituents in the part of northern Germany that I represent. They're really seeing that it comes closer. It's basically only one country by the name of Poland in between of us. So people are feeling the threat and taking this very seriously, and they're expecting an answer by the government. And this situation is not only unpleasant, but it's really a threat also to the economic situation. I mean, the European Union is is facing challenges on different borders. You have the Greece issue, you have the immigration issue, you have the Ukraine-Russia issue, which I think is only the fire that needs to be, the latter one, the fire that needs to be extinguished right now.
So let's talk about immigration for a second before we go into questions. I mean, the demographic reality of Europe will tell you that it does need a new source of labor supply, and yet we're having this big issue with immigration. I think, Claire, you mentioned talent and the availability of talent. That's something your companies look for. I mean, how important is it to them, the ability to attract talent from different countries and not just the Eurozone, the European area, and how much this immigration weighs on their decision to locate in London or elsewhere?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential, and we have articulated in the UK what we call a scale-up crisis. There's this concept of businesses and innovative technologies being incubated in the UK, and then going to the US following the money. And I think part of that problem is the ability to very quickly attract commercial talent to help scale a business and keep them located within UK and Europe. You asked me about why I don't have a business in Berlin. And I think the reason is I specialize in fintech, and I work with entrepreneurs who have great innovations in this space, and the UK has created a very favorable policy environment for these new innovations to flourish. It's simpler, cost-effective regulatory environment, and it has this great access to talent. We all across Europe need to, and globally need to specialize in our local assets. And so Berlin has this wonderful creative tech scene, and the UK is known for its great financial history and financial services. So it's important that we can specialize as cities and as countries, and then very easily trade and invest across our borders. Many of the over 50% of the 175 companies that I work with at Level 39 have come from abroad. And they all say to me, I need access to better developer talent, creative talent, marketing talent, commercial talent. I'm looking for a great CTO. And these talent pools exist across Europe, particularly in Estonia, for example, a really great developer country. And we need to be able to access those, attract those entrepreneurs and that talent to fuel our businesses.
Do you want to talk about immigration? Or?
No.
Well, I want to ask Howard, and one question for each one of you, different ones, but I'll just ask you about the immigration issue, which may be different seen from the UK. So I just wanted to ask for your perspective on that.
Well, we created 300,000, we saw 300,000 net migration to the UK last year. So that's 0.5% of the population. Why? Most of those jobs came from the EU because there's freedom of movement within the EU. People came to work. They came to work in the country that's creating the most jobs because it's got the most flexible labour market. And so we've created 2 million jobs actually over the last 5 years. It's quite extraordinary. The other country that's created a lot of jobs is, in fairness, Germany. And so Germany, in my opinion, will also see more migration, particularly to the city centres, and then it will become more controversial in Germany as well. But at the moment, it's particularly controversial in the UK. Why? Because under the current system, anyone can come from the EU, and there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, that this migration is keeping labour rates down, so downward competitive pressure on wages, and also being a relatively small island with a very heavily protected green belt, there's a shortage of space. And so our hospitals, our schools, our housing, there's a shortage. So people see that they can't get their children on the housing ladder, that the emergency room of the hospital is overcrowded, and they think that's because of immigration. I don't like that. And this is probably, in the UK election, after the economy, the top two issues are the health service and immigration. And one of the reforms that I mentioned earlier that I think will eventually, inevitably happen as part of this EU renegotiation, if there is one, which is not necessarily a good thing for the economy, is a change in the EU law where you can have unlimited migration per year. Cameron, in the last election, 2010, said he was going to limit it to 100,000 a year, 100,000 a year. Last year it was 300,000, so it was triple. And coming back to the point earlier in terms of recruiting the right talent, it creates a big problem because if you're getting such a large flow of migration from elsewhere in Europe, you have to have an even more restrictive policy of allowing people from outside of Europe, elsewhere in the world, to come in when really you'd want those people, so you'd want that talent. So certainly between 2000 and 2010, London was a magnet for attracting people with talent from all around the world. But now the immigration law has been tightened up very significantly to make it much harder to bring people in who are not from the EU, because there's so many people from the EU who want to come in. So it's a very, very big and challenging issue for the UK.
May I add something? The real world is differently right now. I mean, we're talking like we just can look where are they? You know, where's the pool of talents throughout Europe? And we want these. We have a pressure from the south. I mean, thousands and tens of thousands of immigrants are coming over the Mediterranean Sea, especially to Lampedusa, to the small island of Lampedusa, to Italy, and so the big issues now, not for the whole of Europe. What are we going to do with the people? I mean, about 10,000 or even 20,000 have died already on their way from North Africa on crowded small little boats, drunk in the Mediterranean Sea, which is a catastrophe. And this needs to be changed. I mean, this has to do with money. You know about the Italian government's program and the European Frontex program, and so the reality looks a little bit different, I think, from my perspective. I mean, we're facing these with massive pressure, coming from of immigrants coming, especially from Africa to Europe, and this is the larger challenge that we have to find solutions for. I mean, it's not like cherry picking from a pool of talent.
Yes.
Yeah, obviously.
It's a different world.
Yeah,
Both are real worlds,
right.
but these are the actual things that are happening right now.
I have a question for you, but I don't want to deprive the audience of the chance, so I'll ask it only if there's no good questions. No pressure.
There's a pool of talent.
The pool of talent here is very high, so we should be fine. So I think we have microphones roaming around. Perfect. So one here in the second row. Can you please identify yourself and specify if this is directed to one of the members of the panel?
I'm one of those Germans in the room. I'm the German Consul General. My name is Bernd Fischer. The naming of the room leads me to the question. The room is called the Dayton Room. In the mid-90s, the Dayton Agreement finished the then most dangerous conflict post-World War II in Europe with the help of the United States, with the guidance, with the leadership of the United States. So I'm wondering, what is this panel thinking about the role of the host country of this conference, the United States, in helping the volatilities in Europe? Are they interested? Basic questions. And if yes, how? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to take that question? Mohammed, do you want to volunteer?
As in you volunteered me.
Yeah.
Okay, so relative to your historical benchmark, the ability of the US to play that role, and that role is to inform, influence, and even impose solutions. The ability has come down a little bit, but what has dramatically come down is the willingness to play that role. Right? And that has come down, first, there are so many different items on the agenda right now for the US. And secondly, the internal politics is causing the US to be much more insular. And it will happen in Germany. Non-traditional parties have a tendency of completely changing the dynamics because you have suddenly to worry about your fringe, and it changes the dynamics. So I don't think the US is going to play the role. I have a lot of sympathy for Ian Bremmer's view that we're living in the G0 world, that this is no longer a G7 or a G20 or a G1 or G3, but it's a G0 world. And the US is not going to be the global conductor that it used to be in the past.
I think maybe I'll just add one thing. In conversations that I have with people in DC, I think some people in Washington look at Europe quite perplexed in the sense that, and they don't want to kind of interject the U.S. into European problems, and are just, they wonder why Europe can't kind of get its act together on the economic front. And I think there is a genuine kind of bewilderment amongst some senior officials in Washington with respect to Europe.
That's a good point. There's a question right here in the corner, and then we'll go over there.
Edward Ironman from Fitch Ratings, so my question is not for James. But I would like to follow up on that point because politics in the US, politics in the UK are federal. And the currency zones work because you have transfers between the states, because you have federal institution that bails out banks, that pays Social Security, and then when there's unemployment, you can get angry at a senator or a congressman. If you're a Greek, you can, you know, what's your federal outlet? If you're German, what's your federal outlet? So my question is, where are we on the road towards a more federal Europe? And what kind of crisis does it take to get us there, or do we sort of see it in front of us and move forward?
Peter, do you wanna? Then I'm sure how you wanna comment about federal Europe.
Well, yes.
No, but let's hear from Peter first.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if I understood your point correctly, but again, in Germany we have this, we have this federal government, as you know, this state level lender, which is a working system, talking about a more integrated European Union. As you know, I mean, I think the internal market is a great success story. We have the single European currency, which is part of this more closing in together, which has some problems right now, but overall this is a success story. We have to find a new narrative to develop the European Union even further, which I think has to do with transferring more sovereignty from the national capitals, also from the, and I'm talking as a parliamentarian, I should hate to say this, but if you believe in the European Union in the future, which I strongly do, you have to be convinced that you have to transfer more sovereignty, more competences to reform European Union institutions. Again, this is should be part of a more stronger integration process. And being a little bit visionary, if you want to, where's the new narrative for the European Union, which are among fiscal, beyond fiscal things, and beyond currency, beyond legal harmonization. How can we bring this to a more Brussels government, United States of Europe level, maybe in the energy sector? I mean, one of the points that during the last heads of states summit in Brussels were discussed were, talking about a harmonized European Union energy politics, which is really by and in itself visionary, given Germany's exit strategy out of nuclear power supply, and others are very dependent on. So there are, on a multi-layer, there are different aspects to bring this more to a European Union federal level. But the point that Mohamed touched upon twice already during the discussion, nationalist tendencies. If you look to the in the last May, there were elections to the European Parliament, and there were throughout Europe almost new right-wing populist nationalist parties that have been elected in small quantities with just very few European parliamentarians, but altogether, I mean, this is a development that you cannot ignore. So, responsibly acting heads of state, politicians in Europe, they have to find answers to this and explain to their peoples, respectively, why this is not, why this is hurting themselves. I mean, again, developing European Union further is much better than putting up national barriers again. So I think, and most of the heads of states are very much convinced of this idea as well. So I think there is a narrative, there's a conviction that going more on a federal level throughout the European Union is the way to go. Although we have also still, which we must not forget, a enlargement process. I mean, more countries are knocking on the European Union door.
Well, I think Germany has and the Deutschmark bloc have a choice to make. If they're not prepared to allow Greece to exit or push Greece over the edge, which would obviously be enormously costly in terms of the write-off that the ECB would have and having to fund that gap, then they're going to have to decide to pay more. The alternative is really fiscal transfers to the weaker nations, as well as movement of labour out of the weaker nations to the countries that are stronger performing. Because what you see in the US, obviously, is the strong states attract people. Florida. People migrate to Florida because there's jobs, sunshine, and low taxes. So,
3 good reasons.
Sorry?
3 good reasons.
Yes. So I think Northern Europe will have to make the choice: do I pay for an exit of Greece and maybe Portugal and accept the write-off, or do I make larger fiscal transfers over time? There'll be other countries within Europe who don't want to join that, who are not part of the euro. For sure, the UK would not, in my view, under any circumstances, with a Conservative government, follow that path. So I think you will get a 2-speed Europe in any event.
So let me add, I think it's a 3-speed Europe. I think there's the UK that's interested in Europe as a single market and as a free trade zone.
Yes.
Right. There is Greece that I think is facing problems that progress in European integration would not help. I mean, the problems are so deep that you need a very focused approach. Then there's the members of the Eurozone who have been sold a certain thing. I mean, all of you are sitting on chairs that have 4 legs. That is what a member of the Eurozone was sold. That we will have a monetary union leg, which exists. We will have a banking union leg, which is like halfway there. We will have a fiscal integration leg, which is not there. And we'll have a more legal political integration leg. So imagine that instead of sitting on a chair with 4 legs, you're sitting on a chair with 1.5 legs. Think of how that, it doesn't feel quite stable. And we can, to answer your question, we can judge this by, are they going to complete banking union? Are they going to complete fiscal integration? And are they going to complete the other things? And if the answer is no, then the Eurozone is going to have problems that go beyond Greece.
We have like 3 minutes, but there's a question right there, so quick question and quick answers, please.
A bit of a follow-up question. A couple of weeks ago in New York, Wolfgang Schäuble said that he thought a Greek exit could be contained, and also in that same set of comments mentioned that Greece had a productivity problem, which, if I were being provocative, I could say had a note of, it's all their fault and we don't need them anyway, underlying it. Which struck me as a materially different sentiment than what I'm hearing on the panel in terms of where Europe could go and a more negative potential outcome. And I wondered if that resonates as political posturing, or if it feels like the sentiment has swung more in that direction recently.
Who wants to
maybe I can comment on this. Now, this would be a misunderstanding if you understood Wolfgang Schäuble's comments, as you just said. I mean, it's not only, one should not reduce this issue of Greece to Germany and Greece and a personal battle more or less between both finance ministers and the countries there, Varoufakis and Schäuble, first of all. Second of all, the Eurozone and the European Union has shown over the past years a tremendous solidarity with Greece, which is still in place. I mean, I myself and the whole German Bundestag just recently voted for a extension of a deadline for these fiscal support packages underway already, and so there's a consensus that solidarity is in place and will be maintained to a certain point, because so far the Greece government has not delivered anything substantially. They have withdrawn reforms, tiny reforms that the predecessor government implemented already. So up to date, there's nothing that they really delivered, and I will not vote for a for a third package that it might or might not come over the summer.
Okay.
And a lot of my colleagues will do this, act on the same.
Can I just ask you, what do you mean by you won't vote for a third package?
I will vote no
to another write-off.
to fresh money for Greece.
They can't stay without fresh money. It's obvious. I mean, 270 billion of sovereign debt. You can't be seriously thinking.
Also,
I
we
I
can't stay in this room. It's like this. In Europe, we can't stay in this room.
about this
so
later.
We need to. Yeah, you guys should.
I'm representing my
Yeah.
people.
Well,
I understand.
so thankfully you guys are the opposite. So, now very quickly, just a final word on this points
Yeah,
about the productivity
okay.
problem and.
Well, I was going to address the general question about whether or not the institutional infrastructure is there such that if Greece exits, then it's all okay. I think that's wishful thinking, to be honest. I don't think the institutional infrastructure has been developed along the lines of what Mohammed said, the 1.5-legged chair. I would put that architecture, which is supposed to protect the European, the euro area from further crisis, the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, the old EFSF, are simply not large enough. Because if the markets turn from Greece to, they're inevitably going to ask the question, if Greece exits, who's next? If they start to look at other larger countries, then the lending capacity of those institutions simply isn't big enough.
Great. And with that, I mean, as you can see, there'll be a follow-up discussions later on. We'll take it outside, literally. And thank you very much. And thanks to the panel for a great discussion. Thanks very much.